She left with nothing, he kept everything. Then, the envelope changed it all. When my brother turned 25, the family gave him $35,000 and called it a head start. When I turned 18, they handed me the driveway. I packed 2 suitcases into a car with 60,000 miles already on it and drove myself to a university in another state. No scholarship, no safety net, no one checking in. I paid my own tuition, my own rent, my own student loans. Built my salary from $31,000 a year to $91,000, slowly, without any assistance, without anyone asking how. 3 years ago, my mother needed emergency surgery. The hospital bill came to $26,000. Insurance covered $8,000. Nobody in my family discussed the remaining $18,000. I transferred it from my savings on a Thursday afternoon, quietly, without telling anyone. Because it was the right thing to do. Because she was my mother. Nobody paid me back. Nobody mentioned it since. That was the year I stopped being surprised by this family. Then, 9 months ago, a letter arrived from a law firm in Virginia I had never contacted. My grandfather, the one person in that family who had been watching and weighing and deciding since I was 11 years old, had filed something 2 years earlier, quietly, with a different attorney, a different case number. Without telling a single other person, he asked only that I read it alone first, then call him. We spoke for 2 hours and 17 minutes. He died 11 weeks later. This morning I drove 412 miles to sit across from my brother in a conference room. The brother who believes he is about to inherit everything. I set a plain manila folder on the table in front of me and laid my hands flat on top of it. I did not open it. $4.2 million. Every acre of Hargrove land. Filed, recorded, and legally binding. 2 years of silence. He has no idea it exists. Tell me where you are listening from right now and stay with me. The Hargrove name built every acre of that land. And the Hargrove name is going to keep every acre of it. Starting today. Preston Hargrove did not look up when he said it. He was already seated at the head of the mahogany conference table, the chair that had been left empty for the senior partner, the chair that nobody had invited him to take. He had taken it anyway. His jacket was pressed, his tie was silver, his hands were folded in front of him like a man who had already decided how this meeting would end. Eleanor Hargrove walked through the door 11 seconds later. She did not rush. She did not scan the room for a reaction. She did not look at her brother. She moved to an open chair along the side of the table, not the head, not the foot, just a chair, set her worn leather bag down without a sound, and sat. Her blazer was gray, her expression was neutral. Her hands, when she placed them flat on the table in front of her, were completely still. She had driven 412 miles from Chicago that morning. She had left at 4:47 in the morning. She had not slept the night before. None of that showed on her face. Ellie. Preston said her name the way you say the name of something small. Something that shows up when it is convenient and disappears when it is not. Glad you could make it. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at the stack of documents in front of her and said nothing. The conference room at Whitmore & Associates held 14 people that afternoon. 6 were family. 2 were estate attorneys, 1 representing the family, 1 representing a separate legal instrument that most people in the room did not yet know existed. 3 were court-required witnesses. 2 were financial auditors. 1 was a junior paralegal named Cassie who had arrived at 8 in the morning and had not moved from her chair in the corner since. It was 1:49 in the afternoon. 2 hours and 11 minutes until the filing deadline at the Fairfax County Courthouse. Preston cleared his throat. I think we all know why we are here. Grandfather passed 8 weeks ago. The family is ready to move forward. He glanced at Gerald Ashby, the family's estate attorney, 22 years in the Hargrove service, a man who had learned to be very careful with his words around Preston. Gerald, I think we can proceed. Gerald Ashby opened his folder. Then he paused. He looked at Eleanor. She gave him a small nod. Just once. He looked back at his papers. Before we begin the formal reading, Ashby said, measuring each word, I need to acknowledge that there are 2 separate legal instruments relevant to the Hargrove estate. The first is the last will and testament of James Edward Hargrove, dated February 2019. He set a document on the table. The second is a separate instrument, filed at a different time with a different legal team under a different case number. He placed a second document beside the first. Both are legally valid in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Both are fully binding. The order in which we address them matters significantly. Preston leaned forward. What does that mean, Gerald? It means, Ashby said, that we should take our time. Preston sat back. He smiled, the practiced smile of a man who had spent 42 years being told he was right. Of course, we have all the time we need. The estate is not going anywhere. Across the table, Eleanor reached into her bag and placed a plain manila folder on the table in front of her. She did not open it. She laid her hands flat on top of it and waited. In the corner, Cassie, 24 years old, 18 months into her first real position at a law firm, watched Eleanor's face and noted something she would describe later that evening as the expression of someone who has already read the last page of the book and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. 1:53 in the afternoon, 2 hours and 7 minutes. Near the door, in a chair slightly removed from the main table, sat Martha Gaines. She was 66 years old. She had worked on the Hargrove property for 31 years, longer than Preston had been married, longer than Eleanor had been a legal adult, longer than this law firm had been in business. She had been summoned to the reading by a letter from Preston's personal assistant describing her attendance as a courtesy. Inside the letter had been a second document folded once a single page titled Revised Property Access and Residency Agreement, which proposed to reclassify Martha's on-property cottage, the home where she had lived and worked for over 3 decades, under new estate management terms. The document offered her 60 days to vacate or renegotiate at a rate of $200 per month. Martha had read it 3 times on the drive over. She had not signed it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched Eleanor's face, the way you watch the face of someone you hope, very quietly, is going to say something. 2 seats to Preston's left, Aunt Patricia Hargrove. Mills, 58 years old, the last surviving sibling of James Hargrove, stared at the surface of the table. Preston had turned to her with the casual warmth of someone collecting votes he assumed he already had. "Pat, you good?" "I am fine, Preston." Her voice was flat. She was not fine. She had not been fine for 2 years. She opened her mouth. Something shifted behind her eyes. Then she closed it again, looked toward the window, and folded her hands in her lap with the quiet precision of a woman who had made this particular choice so many times it no longer felt like a choice. When does staying silent to keep the peace stop being kindness and start being something you carry home with you every night? When a room full of family makes an assumption about who belongs and who does not, about who built something and who merely inherited the credit for it, does anyone in that room stop to ask whether the assumption was ever actually true? And the woman sitting with her hands pressed flat on that plain manila folder, saying nothing, waiting, what did she know that not one other person in that conference room had thought to ask about? 1:57 in the afternoon. Gerald Ashby set his pen down carefully. The second attorney, the one representing the separate instrument, opened his briefcase and removed a sealed document with a Fairfax County case number stamped in red across the top. The junior paralegal in the corner turned to a fresh page in her notepad, and in a conference room in Virginia on a Tuesday in October, a story that had been 17 years in the building was about to be told. 9 months earlier, Eleanor Hargrove sat in her office on the 14th floor of a building on West Monroe Street in Chicago, Illinois, at 6:43 in the morning, before the rest of the building had arrived. The office was 110 square feet. She had measured it herself on the first day, the way she measured most things, not because the number mattered, but because knowing it did. The desk was second-hand, bought for $85 from an accountant who was downsizing. The chair was the one good piece of furniture in the room. A used steel case she had taken 4 months to save for, because she spent 11 hours a day in it, and her lower back had started sending signals she could not ignore. The window looked directly into the ventilation shaft of the building next door. After 7 years, she had stopped noticing it. Her rent was $1,340 a month. Her car, a 2017 Honda Civic with 94,000 miles on it, cost $280 a month in payments and roughly $180 in maintenance. Student loans from the finance degree she had paid for entirely herself at the University of Illinois ran $610 a month, with 4 years remaining. Her phone bill was $67. Groceries averaged $310 if she was careful. She was almost always careful. She had $22,400 in savings. Not because she earned little. She cleared $91,000 a year as an independent financial analyst, which was not nothing and had taken years of discipline to build from the $31,000 she had started at. But because 3 years ago her mother had needed emergency surgery, the hospital bill had come to $26,000. Insurance covered $8,000. Nobody in the family had discussed the remaining $18,000. Eleanor had transferred it from her savings account on a Thursday afternoon without telling anyone because her mother needed it and because it was the right thing to do and because she had learned early that in the Hargrove family, doing the right thing and receiving acknowledgement for it were two separate events that rarely occurred in the same year. Nobody had paid her back. Nobody had mentioned it since. On that January morning, she was reviewing a set of documents that had been couriered to her office the previous Friday from a law firm in Fairfax, Virginia, Whitmore and Associates. She had not hired them. She had not contacted them. The package had arrived with a cover letter that read, "Dear Ms. Hargrove, your grandfather, James Edward Hargrove, has asked that we make you aware of a legal instrument established in your name on March 14, 2021. The relevant documents are enclosed. He has asked only that you read them alone first and then call him." She had called him that Friday evening. They had spoken for 2 hours and 17 minutes. It was the longest conversation they had had in a decade. It was also, as it would turn out, one of the last. James Edward Hargrove died 11 weeks after that phone call. He was 81 years old. His doctor said his heart had simply decided it was finished. He had not been in pain. He had been, by all accounts, entirely at peace. Eleanor had not cried at the funeral. Not because she did not feel it. She felt it in a way that pressed against the back of her ribs for weeks afterward, a weight that did not announce itself loudly but never fully left. But because Preston had positioned himself at the front of the chapel and narrated his own grief with such volume and detail that there was simply no space left in the room for anyone else's. She had stood near the back and held her grandfather privately, the way she had learned to hold most things that mattered to her. The project she had been preparing, the one James had made possible, had been in development for 26 months by the time he passed. It had begun as a set of conversations, then a framework, then a series of meetings with 2 attorneys, a certified financial planner, a tax specialist, and the records office of Fairfax County Circuit Court. Then, on March 14, 2021, it had become something else entirely, something filed, something with a case number, the Hargrove Family Trust. Filed and recorded at the Fairfax County Circuit Court, Commonwealth of Virginia, naming Eleanor Ann Hargrove as sole trustee, with full controlling authority over the 340-acre Hargrove estate, the primary family residence, 4 additional land parcels across 2 counties, and all associated financial accounts and instruments. Total appraised value at the time of filing, $4.2 million. The trust had not been referenced in James's public will, the document Gerald Ashby had on file, the one Preston had requested a summary of and described over dinner as clean and straightforward. It had not come up at holiday meals. It had not been mentioned to Eleanor's parents, to Preston, or to any extended family member in the 2 years and 7 months since it was recorded. It had existed quietly, in a courthouse, waiting for a specific date that had not yet arrived. James had been precise about why he wanted it structured this way. If they find out before I am gone, he had told Eleanor during that 2-hour and 17-minute phone call, his voice steady in the way it always was when he had already settled something in his own mind. Preston retains counsel within 48 hours. Your father goes silent and follows Preston's lead, the way he has since 1987. Your aunt agrees with everyone in the room and disagrees with no one after she leaves it. And you spend the last months I have on this earth fighting a battle I built for you to win, while I am still here watching you fight it, and unable to do anything except feel guilty. He had paused for a long moment. I want you to win it clean, Ellie. I want there to be no question, no room, no argument anyone can make that has any ground to stand on. She had asked him if he was absolutely certain. I have been certain, he said, for 17 years. 17. That was the number she kept returning to in the months that followed, not 3, the age of the trust, not 26, the months of preparation. 17 years. which meant that James Hargrove had begun watching, weighing, and deciding when Eleanor was 18 years old. When she had packed 2 suitcases, loaded a car with 60,000 miles already on it, and driven herself to a university dormitory in another state, while Preston, at 25, already settled, already positioned as the family's next chapter, received a $35,000 cash gift from their parents described as help to get started. Eleanor had learned about that gift 6 years later. Her mother had mentioned it the way you mention something you assume everyone already knows. A detail, a footnote, nothing worth clarifying. Eleanor had said nothing in response. She had simply filed the information in the place where she kept things that told her something true about the shape of her family and continued building quietly on her own. There were 3 deadlines running simultaneously on the day of the estate reading. 3 clocks. Eleanor had mapped on a legal pad the week before and committed to memory, because she did not need to write down the things she could not afford to forget. The first clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The trust activation documents had to be physically filed at the Fairfax County Courthouse before the close of business. If the documents were not filed by 4 o'clock, Preston's attorneys, placed quietly on retainer 3 weeks prior, could file an emergency estate contestation. That contestation would freeze all Hargrove assets for a review period of up to 18 months. 18 months was enough time to retain additional counsel, enough time to build a counter-narrative, enough time, in short, for a great many things that James Hargrove had specifically designed this arrangement to prevent. The second clock, 6:30 in the evening. The family dinner, already arranged, already catered, already confirmed with 53 guests at the Hargrove estate. Preston had organized it 3 weeks ago and described it to family members as a gathering to discuss the estate's future. 2 reporters from the Fairfax County Gazette had been personally contacted by Preston's assistant and told to expect a significant announcement regarding the future of the Hargrove family legacy. The main course had been selected. The seating chart had been finalized. Preston had prepared remarks. The third clock, 8 o'clock in the evening. The memorial candle lighting at the old chapel on the eastern edge of the property. The one James had constructed with his own hands in the summer of 1987. The one where 4 generations of Hargroves had marked the things that could not be marked any other way. Eleanor had made one promise to her grandfather in the last real conversation they had had in person 2 months before he died. "Be in that chapel at 8, he had said. "Light the first candle, not for tradition, not for ceremony. Because I want to know that someone who understands what this land was actually built for will be standing in that room when it matters." The math of the day ahead was not complicated. 2 hours and 11 minutes to change the shape of everything, or watch her brother announce a version of the future that had never been real. She had driven 412 miles to be in that room. She was not leaving without the folder. Eleanor was 11 years old the first time James Hargrove took her somewhere without telling anyone else in the family where they were going. It was a Saturday in late March. She remembered the specific quality of the light that morning, pale and thin, the kind that comes in early spring in Virginia before the season has fully committed to itself, when the air still carries the last edge of winter, but the ground has started to soften. She had been sitting on the back porch of the estate reading a library book about the history of American land law, which was not the kind of thing 11-year-olds typically read on Saturday mornings. But Eleanor had found it on the bottom shelf of James's study 2 weeks earlier, and had been working through it steadily ever since. James had come out of the house, seen what she was reading, and stood still for a long moment. "Put your shoes on," he said. "I want to show you something." He did not tell her what. He did not tell her where. He went to get the truck, the green Ford he had driven since 1994. With 187,000 miles on it, and a passenger seat that had a slight lean to the left because Eleanor's grandmother had always sat with her weight toward the window, and James had never had the seat adjusted. Eleanor climbed in. James pulled out of the long driveway without explaining. They drove 40 minutes to Fairfax. The law office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Main Street that smelled like old paper and central heating, and faintly of the cedar panels someone had installed in the waiting room sometime in the 1970s and never replaced. The attorney was a man named Thomas Whitmore, not the Thomas Whitmore who ran the firm today, but his father, the one who had founded it. who was then in his early 60s and had the handshake of a man who had spent 4 decades understanding that what people said they wanted and what they actually needed were almost never the same thing. Thomas Whitmore Sr. shook James's hand. He nodded at Eleanor. He did not ask her to wait outside. James sat across from Whitmore at the conference table and asked him to bring the Hargrove case files. Not the current ones. The old ones. The ones from 1961. Whitmore brought a banker's box. Dusty. Heavy. He set it on the table and left the room without being asked. James opened the box and began laying documents out in a specific order, not randomly, Eleanor realized, but in the sequence of events. The way you lay out the chapters of a story you have read so many times, you no longer need to think about which part comes first. Read these, he said. Take your time. She read for 40 minutes. James sat across from her and did not speak. He did not check his watch. He did not look at the window. He simply waited, with the particular patience of a man who understood that some things could not be rushed without losing something important in the rushing. What she was reading was the legal history of Henry Hargrove, James's grandfather, Eleanor's great-great-grandfather, and the 180 acres of Virginia farmland he had lost in the summer of 1961. Not to fraud. Not to any act of overt dishonesty. To a deed transfer document that had been drafted, agreed upon, discussed in detail over 3 separate family dinners, and then never properly countersigned by the second party. Henry Hargrove had arranged to transfer a parcel of that land to a cousin named Robert, with a verbal agreement that Robert would, in exchange, assume responsibility for a mortgage on the main property that Henry could no longer sustain on his own. It was a reasonable arrangement. Both men understood it clearly. Both men intended to honor it. Robert had said he would bring the paperwork to the notary the following Thursday. Robert died on a Wednesday. A stroke. Sudden and complete. No warning. Without Robert's countersignature, the transfer was legally incomplete. Without the transfer, the mortgage assumption never took effect. Without the mortgage assumption, Henry began to fall behind on payments within 3 months. The bank that held the note had no obligation to renegotiate. They exercised their right to foreclose. Henry spent 7 years in court attempting to recover the property on the basis of the verbal agreement, supported by the testimony of 4 family members who had been present at the dinners where the arrangement was discussed. The courts found consistently that testimony regarding verbal agreements could not supersede the absence of a properly executed legal instrument. 7 years, $140,000 in legal fees calculated at present value. 180 acres gone, because 2 men trusted the conversation and forgot about the paper. When Eleanor finished reading, she set the last document down carefully and looked up at her grandfather. He was watching her, not with the expression of someone waiting for the right answer, with the expression of someone who had already decided that whatever she said next, he would listen to it completely. "What do you notice?" he asked. Eleanor thought about it for a moment. The cedar smell, the pale light coming through the 3rd-floor window, the weight of the documents she had just held. He trusted the conversation, she said, instead of the paper. James nodded slowly. Everyone trusted the conversation. The conversation disappeared when the people who had had it did. He reached out and placed one hand flat on top of the stack of documents. The paper stayed. But it said the wrong thing, because nobody had made it say the right thing while there was still time. He looked at her the way he only looked at her, not at Preston, not at her parents, not at the extended family who gathered every summer on the back lawn and talked about the Hargrove legacy as though it were a thing that perpetuated itself automatically without effort or intention. "You are the only one who asks why, Ellie, not what you will get, but why it matters, why the land exists, why the family built it, what it is actually supposed to do." He picked up the old deed document and held it for a moment before placing it carefully back in the box. That is the difference between someone who inherits something and someone who deserves to keep it. He drove her home. They did not discuss it further. He did not make her promise anything. He did not explain what he had been thinking about on the drive there, or what he intended to do with what she had read. He simply took her home, made her a grilled cheese sandwich because it was past noon and she had not eaten, and went back to whatever he had been doing before. Eleanor thought about that Saturday in Fairfax many times over the following 24 years. Not as a lesson, not as something she had been taught and then applied, but as something that had simply become part of the way she understood the world. The paper is the truth. The conversation is the hope. And hope, in matters of property and law and inheritance, is not a strategy. That understanding did not leave her. It became the architecture of everything she built after. And today, in a conference room in Fairfax, 40 minutes from the office where Thomas Whitmore Sr. had left a banker's box on a table for an 11-year-old girl, was the day that architecture would be tested at every load-bearing point it had. 2:03 in the afternoon, 1 hour and 57 minutes until the courthouse deadline. Gerald Ashby set his reading glasses on the bridge of his nose and opened the formal estate documents with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this hundreds of times and understood that the most important thing about reading a will in a room full of family members was controlling the pace. The last will and testament of James Edward Hargrove, Ashby began, was executed on February 11, 2019, in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary of the Commonwealth of Virginia. The document addresses the distribution of personal property, financial accounts designated outside the trust structure, and specific bequests to named individuals. He read for 6 minutes. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms full of people with competing interests go quiet when money is being discussed, not comfortable silence, but the silence of calculation. Furniture, art, a pocket watch that had belonged to James's father. Small things, named things. Preston received the pocket watch. He picked it up from the table when Ashby indicated it had been pre-retrieved from the estate, turned it over once in his hand, and set it down in front of him with the satisfaction of a man collecting the first piece of a set he expected to complete before the afternoon was over. Eleanor received a cedar box that had sat on the windowsill of James's study for as long as she could remember. She did not open it. She set it on the table beside her manila folder and kept her hands flat. At this point, Ashby said, setting down the will and removing his reading glasses, "I would like to introduce the second legal instrument relevant to the Hargrove estate. This document was filed separately from the will, under a distinct case number and—" Sir Gerald. Preston's voice was smooth, patient, the voice of a man who had prepared for this specific moment. "Before we go any further with secondary documents, I think the family deserves to understand the established framework here." He reached into the leather portfolio in front of him and produced a document, crisp, bound with a navy cover, the Hargrove family crest embossed at the top. He set it on the table and slid a copy toward Ashby and another toward the second attorney. He did not slide one toward Eleanor. "The Hargrove Ancestral Succession Charter," Preston said, "Article 4, the Primogeniture Clause. It has been the operating principle of this estate since Grandfather James's father established it in 1952. All primary estate assets transfer to the eldest male descendant upon the patriarch's passing, contingent on no contrary legal instrument being filed and validated within 90 days of the date of death." He folded his hands. "Grandfather passed 8 weeks ago. We are within the window. The framework is clear." Ashby looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time, without expression. The second attorney, a man named David Park, 41 years old, who had spent the last 3 years working exclusively on trust and estate law, did not look at the document at all. He looked at Eleanor. She was looking at Preston, not with anger, not with urgency, with the quiet attention of someone listening to a presentation they have already fact-checked. When a document appears in a formal estate proceeding that no one in the room has seen before, presented by the party with the most to gain, framed as established and unquestionable, is the instinct to accept it really clarity? Or is it simply the inertia of assumption wearing the costume of tradition? 2:09 in the afternoon, 1 hour and 51 minutes until the courthouse deadline. Preston. Eleanor's voice when she spoke was even, not warm, not cold. Even, the way a table is level, the way a properly executed document is complete. "Can you tell me where that charter is filed?" Preston blinked. "Once. It is a family document, Ellie. It has been in the estate records for 70 years. "Which court?" she said. "Which case number?" A pause. Brief. The kind of pause that, in a room full of attorneys, means something specific. "It is not a court document," Preston said, his voice carrying the careful patience of someone explaining something to a person who is being deliberately obtuse. It is a family governance instrument. It does not require court filing to be operative. It has been honored across 3 generations of the Hargrove family as the foundational succession principle. Eleanor nodded once, slowly, as if she were filing the answer in a specific place in her memory. "I would like a copy," she said. "Of course." Preston's assistant, a young man named Daniel who had been standing near the wall since the meeting began, produced a bound copy and set it in front of Eleanor. She opened it to page 1, then page 2. Then she turned to the signature page at the back, which bore a single signature, James Edward Hargrove, 1952, with no notary seal, no witness signatures, and no county recording stamp. She closed it. She placed it to her left, beside the cedar box. She said nothing further. 2:17 in the afternoon. 1 hour and 43 minutes until the courthouse deadline. David Park cleared his throat. "With the charter noted for the record, I would like to proceed to the second instrument." He opened his briefcase. The Hargrove Family Trust, filed and recorded at the Fairfax County Circuit Court on March 14, 2021. "Hold on." Preston's voice had shifted, still controlled, still institutional, but with something beneath it now. A new pressure. "Gerald, I was not made aware of any separately filed trust instrument. Is this something the family should have been notified of during the estate planning process?" Ashby adjusted his glasses. "The trust was established as a private instrument at your grandfather's specific direction, Preston. He was not legally required to disclose it to beneficiaries or family members prior to his passing. That seems irregular." "It is entirely standard," David Park said quietly, "under Virginia estate law. A grantor has no obligation to notify potential interested parties of a trust's existence prior to activation." Preston looked at Park, then at Ashby, then at Eleanor. She was writing something on a small notepad, quietly, unhurried. She did not look up. "What is she writing?" Preston asked. Nobody answered him. Aunt Patricia, 2 seats to Preston's left, looked at the window. Her jaw was tight. Her hands in her lap had stopped moving. She had the expression of a woman who had arrived at a destination she had known was coming for 2 years, and had spent that entire time pretending she had not. Near the door, Martha Gaines watched Eleanor's pen move across the notepad. Martha had worked for the Hargrove family for 31 years. She had watched Eleanor leave at 18 with 2 bags and a car that needed new brake pads. She had watched Preston be handed a future and accept it as though it had been the only logical outcome. She sat with her hands folded and waited. Eleanor finished writing. She set her pen down. She looked at David Park. "Please continue," she said. Park opened the trust document to the first recorded page. He set it flat on the table where everyone could see the Fairfax County Circuit Court seal, the case number, the date, and the name printed in the designated trustee field. Preston saw it before Park said it aloud. Eleanor watched his face. She had driven 412 miles to see exactly this. The specific moment when a man who had spent his entire life inheriting the assumption of entitlement encountered the one thing that assumption could not override. A properly executed legal document, filed, notarized, recorded, the paper, not the conversation, the paper. 2:24 in the afternoon, 1 hour and 36 minutes until the courthouse deadline. While David Park was reading the trust document's opening language slowly, carefully, in the deliberate cadence of an attorney who understands that the words being spoken aloud are creating a record, Preston's assistant Daniel had quietly left his position near the wall and moved to the corner of the room where Martha Gaines was sitting. He crouched beside her chair. His voice was low, considerate even. He was holding the revised property access and residency agreement with both hands, like something he was offering rather than presenting. "Mrs. Gaines, I want to make sure we have this taken care of before the end of the day." He set the document gently on her knee. "It is really a formality at this point. The estate transition creates some administrative requirements around property access that we just need documented going forward. Same arrangement you have always had, essentially, just formalized. It will not change anything for you day to day." Martha looked at the document on her knee. Then she looked at her purse. She reached in and took out her reading glasses. The pair with the thin gold frame she had bought at a pharmacy in 2019 for $14.99 because she kept leaving her good pair in the kitchen and put them on. She was 66 years old. She had worked on the Hargrove property since she was 35. In that time, she had made the bed in the main house approximately 11,300 times. She had cooked roughly 4,000 meals in that kitchen. She had known Eleanor Hargrove since Eleanor was 8 years old and used to come into the kitchen at 6 in the morning to read at the counter, because the kitchen was the quietest room in the house at that hour. And she never wanted to wake anyone. She read the document, not quickly, word by word. 60 days, she said quietly, almost to herself. It is a standard transition window, Daniel said, estate management procedure. Martha looked up from the page. She looked across the room at Preston. Preston was watching David Park read trust language he appeared to be encountering for the first time and finding deeply unwelcome. He was leaning slightly forward. His jaw was set. His silver tie had not moved. He heard Martha. Eleanor could see from across the room that he heard her. She could see it in the slight recalibration of his shoulders, the fractional adjustment of a man who has registered a sound and made a decision not to respond to it. He did not look at Martha. He did not look at the corner at all. Eleanor's pen stopped moving. 2:31 in the afternoon, 1 hour and 29 minutes until the courthouse deadline. Eleanor did not move immediately. She looked at her notepad. Then at the clock on the wall above Gerald Ashby's head. Then back at Martha in the corner, reading a document she had not been sent in advance without an attorney present, in a room full of people whose interests were entirely distinct from hers. She ran the numbers. If she intervened now, if she said anything, if she directed the room's attention toward the corner, Preston's attorney would have grounds to characterize the formal proceeding as disrupted, not strong grounds. But grounds, and grounds required responses, and responses consumed time, and time was the one resource she could not manufacture more of between now and 4 o'clock. Clock 1 hour and 29 minutes. The courthouse. The filing. The 26 months of correctly sequenced, correctly documented work that had been building toward a single 4 o'clock deadline that did not negotiate and did not extend. Clock 2, 4 hours until Preston stood at a podium in the main room of the Hargrove estate and announced his stewardship of property that was not his to announce. Once that happened, once 53 witnesses had heard it and 2 reporters had written it down, the legal facts would remain the legal facts. But narratives moved faster than corrections, and she had seen, in her years working in finance, what it cost to spend months repairing a story that should never have been told in the first place. Clock 3, the chapel. The candles, the promise, the 26 months, the filing, the sequence, everything correctly done, everything correctly timed. She could wait. Martha's situation could be addressed afterward, through trustee authority, in a context where Eleanor had full legal standing to void any agreement signed without independent counsel. The logic was sound. The logic was defensible. The logic was exactly the kind of thinking that allowed quiet injustices to accumulate in the spaces between proceedings that were technically too important to interrupt. She looked at her phone. 3 notifications. Unread. She looked at Martha. And then Martha did something small. She reached into her purse. She took out a photograph, wallet-sized, worn at the edges, and set it on her knee beside the document. She looked at it for a moment. Then she returned to reading. From across the room, Eleanor could see what the photograph showed. A white cottage, green shutters, a small garden along the front path, the cottage on the eastern edge of the Hargrove property, where Martha had lived and worked for 31 years. She had brought a photograph of her home to the meeting where someone was attempting to take it from her. The way you bring a photograph of something you are not certain you will still have by the time the day is over. When a room full of people with the collective power to act decides that acting can wait, that the right moment is always slightly later, always after the other thing is resolved, always contingent on conditions that keep quietly shifting. Who absorbs the cost of that patience? 2:34 in the afternoon. Eleanor set her pen down, flat on the notepad, parallel to the edge. She looked at the 3 unread messages on her phone. She did not open them. She looked at the clock. She looked at Martha. She stood up. No announcement, no explanation, no glance toward Preston or Ashby or the rest of the table. She simply rose from her chair and walked across the conference room to the corner where a 66-year-old woman was reading a document she should not have been handed without a lawyer. She stood between Martha and Daniel. Mrs. Gaines. Her voice carried the same temperature it had held all afternoon. No edge in it, no performance. Has your attorney reviewed this document? Martha looked up. Something shifted in her face. Not relief exactly, not surprise. the particular expression of someone who had been waiting without allowing themselves to admit it for a specific thing to happen. "I do not have an attorney," Martha said. Eleanor looked at Daniel. "Then this conversation ends here." She said it the way you state a coordinate, a fact with a location. Any agreement executed without independent legal counsel in the context of an active estate proceeding is challengeable under Virginia law. Table this until Mrs. Attil. Gaines has had the opportunity to retain representation. Daniel looked at Preston. Preston was looking at Eleanor. "Ellie." His voice carried the patience of someone managing an unexpected variable. "This is a separate administrative matter. It does not fall within the scope of today's proceeding. I am the trustee of this estate," Eleanor said. "Everything on this property falls within my scope." The room was very quiet. It was the first time she had said it. Not as a claim in dispute, not as a challenge, as a statement of the current state of things, the way you state a recorded case number or a filing date or the name on a legally executed document. David Park did not react. He had been waiting for that specific sentence since he entered the room. Cassie turned to a fresh page in her notepad and wrote 4 words. Eleanor could not read from where she stood. In her chair, 2 seats from Preston, Aunt Patricia had watched all of it. The document on Martha's knee, Daniel crouching beside her, Eleanor standing, the sentence. She opened her mouth, her hands pressed flat against her thighs. She thought about the phone call James had made to her 26 months ago, the quiet Tuesday evening call in which he had explained what he had decided and why, and she had listened and said she understood, and told him she thought he was right. She had meant it. She had meant every word. And then she had spent the following 2 years in the Hargrove family exactly the way she had spent most of her life in it, present and formed, and silent in the specific way of people who believe that knowing the truth and withholding it are 2 separate moral categories when they are in practice the same act. She closed her mouth. She looked at the window. When the people who hold the truth decide that holding it privately is enough, that witnessing is a form of action, that being present absolves them of what the room produces in their silence. What exactly do they believe they are protecting? 2:38 in the afternoon, 1 hour and 22 minutes until the courthouse deadline. Preston picked up his phone. He did not raise his voice. He turned a quarter away from the table, the implied privacy of a man who had decided this was a separate conversation, and dialed a number he had clearly prepared in advance. "Marcus," he said, measured, controlled. The voice of someone managing a situation, not reacting to one. "We have a development at the reading. Secondary instrument introduced without prior family notification. I need you to prepare a protective motion on estate assets pending full independent review of all succession documents." A pause. He listened. "Yes, today." Another pause. Standard language, potential irregularity in the instrument's chain of custody, request for verification before any transfer of controlling authority. He did not look at Eleanor, he looked at the far wall. "File it as precautionary. As soon as you can move." He set the phone down. He straightened his tie. "Gerald." His voice returned to the table's register, inclusive, reasonable, the voice of a man who was only asking for what any reasonable person would ask. "I need to formally request a pause in this proceeding until the estate's primary counsel has had full opportunity to review the secondary instrument. A document none of us were made aware of before today deserves appropriate due diligence. I think we can all agree on that." Ashby looked at the table. "Preston, I have reviewed the trust as estate attorney Gerald. Not as the family's advocate, there is a meaningful distinction." Preston spread his hands flat and open, the gesture of a man inviting consensus. "I am not contesting anything. I am asking for time and transparency, both of which seem entirely reasonable in the context of a $4.2 million estate." 2:41 in the afternoon, 1 hour and 19 minutes. David Park set his pen down with the deliberate quiet of someone who has decided that what he is about to say needs to land without interference. A protective motion filed on estate assets triggers an automatic stay under Virginia probate procedure. 72 hours minimum. During the stay, no trust instruments can be executed or filed with any court. He said it without inflection, without editorializing. A fact delivered into the room, leaving the room to do what it would with it. If the stay is received by the courthouse before 4 o'clock today, The trust activation window closes without filing. The room absorbed this. Preston absorbed this in the specific way of a man who already knew it and was watching other people understand it for the first time. Against the far wall, a man Eleanor had noticed earlier, a family acquaintance of Preston's, mid-30s, who had been seated quietly since the meeting opened and had said nothing in 2 hours, had his phone angled upward. The camera was running. Eleanor noted it, filed it, returned her attention to David Park. "Realistic timeline for Marcus Webb's motion to reach the courthouse?" she asked. Park checked his watch. 40 to 50 minutes if his office moves immediately. 2:44 in the afternoon. 1 hour and 16 minutes. 3 things happened in the same moment. Eleanor's phone lit up. She had seen the notifications accumulating for 20 minutes. She picked it up now. The first message was from Park's paralegal, sent from outside the room. "Courthouse confirmed hard close, 4 o'clock today, no exceptions. Need signed trustee authorization to proceed with filing. Please advise immediately." The second was from her cousin Dana at the estate, caterers setting up since 2. Preston's people moved furniture in the main room. "There is a podium, Eleanor. An actual podium. Where are you?" The third was from Rose, the woman who had cared for the chapel for 15 years, who had asked 3 weeks ago if she could be the one to prepare it for the memorial. "Candles are ready. 8 o'clock. He always said you would come. I told him you would." Eleanor read all 3. She set the phone face down on the table. She did not respond to any of them. 2:47 in the afternoon. 1 hour and 13 minutes. Preston was speaking, something about chain of custody, something about the family's right to understand instruments executed in their name, something about transparency as a founding principle of estate law. Each sentence was technically accurate. Each sentence, removed from its context, would sound entirely reasonable to a judge. Eleanor looked at the clock on the wall. She thought about the chapel, the west-facing window, the specific angle of October light at 8 in the evening that turned the old pine walls the color of the Virginia clay her grandfather had described in the stories he told on summer evenings. The clay his grandfather had farmed a land that had been lost, the ground that James had spent his life making sure would not be lost again. He had built that chapel with his own hands, mixed the mortar, set each foundation stone level, built it to last the way he had tried to build everything, not impressively, not visibly, but correctly, with the right materials, filed in the right order, documented against the day when documentation would be the only thing that remained. Is a promise made to a dying man diminished when keeping it costs something real, or does that cost make it the only kind of promise that actually reveals what a person is made of? 2:51 in the afternoon. 1 hour and 9 minutes. Preston leaned slightly toward Gerald Ashby. He lowered his voice to the register of a private conversation in a room where no conversation was private. "She has been building toward this for years, Gerald. You can see the architecture of it, the timeline, the filing sequence, the staged proceeding." His voice carried a precision that was worse than anger. It was the precision of someone who had rehearsed this, who had decided what story he would tell about today before today had happened. This is not about grandfather's intentions. This is a campaign. The room heard it. Every person at that table heard it. Eleanor heard it. She did not look up. She reached into her bag and removed her laptop. She opened it on the table in front of her. She navigated to a file that was already organized, already tabbed, already exactly where she needed it to be. She began to read through it with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has arrived at the section of the day they have spent months preparing for and finds, now that they are in it, that the preparation was sufficient. Preston watched her. He watched for a long moment, reading, calm, completely unperturbed by the protective motion his attorney was preparing, by the clock on the wall, by the room full of people watching her as though she were doing something they did not yet understand. "What is she doing?" he said. Nobody answered. Cassie looked up from her notepad and looked back down. Martha Gaines, in the corner, quietly folded the revised property access and residency agreement, the document she had not signed, and placed it back in her purse beside the photograph of the cottage. David Park was looking at his own documents. He had attended 47 estate proceedings in 11 years. He had learned to distinguish between the expressions people wore when they were about to lose and the expressions they wore when they were about to act. Eleanor Hargrove was not wearing the first expression. 2:53 in the afternoon. She looked up from the laptop. She looked at David Park across the table. "I am ready," she said. 2:55 in the afternoon, 1 hour and 5 minutes until the courthouse deadline. Eleanor turned her laptop to face the center of the table. One gesture, no preamble, no announcement. She simply rotated the screen until it was visible to the room and set it flat, the way you set down a document you have already signed. On the screen was a scanned image of a single page. Clean. Official. The seal of the Fairfax County Circuit Court, Commonwealth of Virginia, in the upper left corner. Below it, in the standardized typography of a recorded legal instrument, Hargrove Family Trust. Recorded March 14, 2021. Fairfax County Circuit Court. Instrument type, Irrevocable Family Trust, Full Asset Transfer. Designated Trustee, Eleanor Ann Hargrove. Authority Classification, Sole Trustee, 100%. Controlling Interest. Effective date, upon passing of grantor James Edward Hargrove. Status, activated, October 8, 2024, 9:17 in the morning. Eleanor said nothing for 12 seconds. She let the room read it. Preston read it. She watched his eyes move across the page. She watched them stop at Eleanor Ann Hargrove. She watched them move to 100% controlling interest. She watched them stop again. Then she spoke. "What that means, Preston, is this." Her voice was the same voice she had used all afternoon. No elevation, no satisfaction in it. The voice of someone reading the terms of a contract that is already in force. As of 9:17 this morning, every decision made in this room regarding the Hargrove estate has been made by someone without legal authority to make it. She indicated the laptop screen with one hand. The chair you are sitting in, the one assigned to the senior partner, was taken by a private citizen with no standing in this proceeding. The Hargrove Ancestral Succession Charter you introduced has no Fairfax County recording stamp, no independent notary certification of witness signatures, and no state case number. It is not a legal instrument. It is an undocumented family tradition. Under Virginia estate law, an unrecorded private governance document cannot supersede a properly filed and recorded trust instrument under any circumstances. She paused. And the protective motion your attorney Marcus Webb is currently preparing cannot be filed against an estate that is already fully transferred and activated. There is nothing left to protect. The room did not move. Preston's mouth opened, closed. His hands on the table were still. Gerald Ashby took off his reading glasses and set them very carefully on the table in front of him. 3:04 in the afternoon, 56 minutes until the courthouse deadline. Eleanor reached to the side of her laptop and opened the second tab of her file, the second document. She turned the screen slightly so the financial columns were visible. This is an independent audit of the Hargrove Estate's operating accounts for the period January 2021 through September 2024, the period during which Preston assumed informal management of estate finances following your father's step back. She kept her eyes on the screen as she spoke, the way you keep your eyes on a map when you are navigating. The audit identifies 3 wire transfers totaling $340,000 from the estate's primary operating account to a private limited liability company registered in Preston's name in Delaware in March 2020. The transfers are recorded in family accounts as property maintenance contracts. There are no corresponding invoices, no third-party vendor verification, no family board authorization because no family board meeting was called. She looked up. There are also 2 instances of estate property being used as collateral for personal loans, one in 2022, one in 2023, without the knowledge or consent of any other family stakeholder. The silence was different now. Not the silence of calculation or of competing interests. The silence of a room that has understood something it cannot ununderstand. "This is not about today," Eleanor said. "Today is simply the day someone was in this room with the documentation and the authority to act." Preston's voice, when it came, was quiet. Controlled still, but with something beneath it now, not anger, something older than anger. "You built this case. You have been constructing this for years, piece by piece, to put me exactly here." Eleanor looked at him. "I filed a trust document my grandfather asked me to file," she said. "I attended an estate reading I was legally entitled to attend. When your assistant approached an employee without legal representation and asked her to sign a document that would revoke her right to her home, I asked him to stop. She kept her voice level. Even. The way a table is level. The charter with no recording stamp was yours. The protective motion was yours. The $340,000 in undocumented transfers was yours. I did not build your case, Preston, you built it. I am simply the person in the room today who has the authority to present it. Preston did not respond. He looked at his hands. Eleanor turned from him. She looked at Patricia. Patricia. One name, direct. Without warmth or coldness, just direction. I need you to call the Fairfax County Recorder's Office and provide verbal trustee authorization for the Hargrove Family Trust filing. They will confirm my name on the instrument and log the authorization for filing. David's paralegal has the number. Patricia looked at her. For the first time all afternoon, Patricia Hargrove Mills looked directly at her niece without looking away. Something moved behind her eyes. 2 years of held weight-shifting position, not disappearing, just moving. Yes, Patricia said. She said it simply. She picked up her phone. Eleanor did not thank her. There was no time for that, and thanks was not what the moment required. What the moment required was the phone call, and Patricia was making it. Eleanor turned to Martha. She picked up her phone. She called David Park's paralegal, who answered on the first ring because he had been waiting outside the conference room for 2 hours. I need a 1-page trustee directive, Eleanor said, voiding the revised property access and residency agreement presented today to Martha Gaines. No consideration period. Immediate effect. Can you have it in 4 minutes? 3, the paralegal said. Eleanor ended the call. She looked at Martha across the room. Mrs. Gaines. Her voice, when it reached Martha, carried something it had not carried in any other exchange that afternoon. Not softness exactly, but intention. The voice of someone who has decided that this particular thing will happen in the next 90 seconds, regardless of what else is happening. You do not need to sign anything today, or on any other day, unless you choose to after consulting with your own attorney. She held Martha's gaze. The cottage is yours. That will be in writing before you leave this building. Martha looked at her. 66 years old. 31 years of work. A photograph of a white cottage in her purse. She did not cry. She pressed her lips together once, firmly, and gave a single nod. The nod of someone who is not surprised but is, nonetheless, relieved in a way that does not fully have words. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, the paralegal entered the room and set a printed, signed directive on the table in front of Martha. Eleanor had authorized it remotely by secure digital signature while Patricia was still on the phone with the county recorder's office. Martha read it, folded it once, set it beside the photograph in her purse. 3:14 in the afternoon, 46 minutes until the courthouse deadline. Eleanor looked at Preston one final time. She did not raise her voice. She did not compose a speech. She did not deliver the line she had been imagining since she was 18 years old and drove away from this property with 2 suitcases. Fairness is not a sentiment, Preston, she said. In estate law, it is structural. What holds is not what the family assumes. It is what the family files. She looked at the charter still sitting on the table in front of him, its cover page with the embossed Hargrove crest, its signature page with no recording stamp, no case number. No evidence it had ever existed outside of this room. Grandfather understood that. He understood it for 17 years. He spent those years making sure the paper said the right thing. She closed her laptop. She looked at David Park. Please proceed with filing, she said. Park was already on the phone. Eleanor stood. She picked up the cedar box James had left her. She picked up the manila folder. She put them in her leather bag. She walked to the door. She did not look back. The conference room at Whitmore & Associates did not empty immediately. It held its breath, the way a room does when something large has just moved through it and the air has not settled yet. Gerald Ashby set both hands flat on the table and looked at the surface of the wood for a long moment. 22 years of representing this family. He thought about the phone call he had received from James Hargrove in March of 2021, asking him to refer Eleanor to a separate firm for a specific filing. He had not asked why. He had understood enough to know that understanding everything was not his job in that particular moment. He picked up his pen and began writing. Cassie, in the corner, looked at her notepad. She had been writing continuously since the meeting began at 1:49. 11 pages. She looked at the last page, the last 40 minutes of notes, and drew a single line beneath the final entry. She did not underline anything. She simply looked at what she had written, the way you look at a record of something you want to make sure you remember accurately. Across the room, the man who had been filming lowered his phone. He looked at the footage, 42 minutes of it. Eleanor at the table, the charter without a recording stamp, the audit figures on the laptop screen, Preston's hands going still. He watched 12 seconds of it in silence. He thought about what Preston had said before the meeting, about the family story, about legacy, about what the Hargrove name meant to the county. He thought about what he had watched happen instead. He opened his messages. He sent the clip, not the full 42 minutes but 3 minutes and 17 seconds of it, beginning with the moment Eleanor turned the laptop screen to a contact he trusted, with one line of text, "You need to see this." Then he put his phone in his jacket pocket and looked at the window. Preston had not moved. He was still in the chair at the head of the table, the chair he had taken without being invited. The pocket watch James had left him was on the table in front of him. He picked it up, turned it once in his hand, set it back down, picked it up again. He was not crying. He was not angry, or rather, the anger had nowhere to go now, no surface to push against, no argument left to make that had any ground to stand on. What was happening behind his eyes was slower than anger, the specific, private cognition of a man whose understanding of himself, of his position, his entitlement, his place in the story, was quietly, irrevocably rearranging. He did not say anything. Nobody asked him to. 2 seats to his left, Patricia had finished the call to the county recorder's office. The confirmation number was written on a notepad in front of her. She set her phone down. Her hands, when she laid them on the table, were not entirely steady, not shaking, but not still either. The specific unsteadiness of someone who has just done a small, necessary thing and understands, without needing it explained, that it does not erase 2 years of a larger, quieter choice. She looked at the confirmation number. She would look at it many times in the months that followed, in the way people look at small evidences of the moments they finally moved. In the corner, Martha Gaines picked up her purse. She stood, slowly, the way she did most things, with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who had spent 66 years learning which things were worth rushing for. She took out the photograph of the cottage. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed it in the front pocket of her purse, not back inside but in the front where she could reach it easily, and walked toward the door. She stopped at the chair where Eleanor had been sitting. Eleanor's chair was empty, her notepad was still there, the pen parallel to the edge the way she had left it. Martha looked at the chair for a moment. 31 years, she said, quietly, to the empty chair, to whatever remained in the room of the woman who had stood up in it. He would have wanted her to know that. Then she walked out. 3:17 in the afternoon, 43 minutes until the courthouse deadline. Eleanor was in the elevator. The lobby was marble and chrome and the particular silence of institutional buildings in the middle of the afternoon. She walked through it without pausing through the glass doors and out into the October air of Fairfax, Virginia, pale autumn light, the last warmth of the season thinning at the edges. The kind of afternoon that reminded her of the drive she had taken with James 40 minutes outside this city when she was 11 years old and the light had come through a third-floor office window, and she had read a story about a man who lost everything because he trusted the conversation and forgot about the paper. She took out her phone. She did not call David Park, he was already filing. She did not call Dana at the estate. That conversation could wait. She called one number. It rang twice. "I am on my way," she said. She hung up. She got in the car and drove east toward the property, toward the 340 acres, toward the chapel on the eastern edge, toward the candles Rose had laid out, toward a promise made to a dying man who had spent 17 years quietly, carefully, correctly making sure that the paper said the right thing. 43 minutes until the courthouse deadline. Enough time to file. And enough time, if she drove the way her grandfather had always driven, unhurried, direct, certain of the destination, to make it to the chapel before the October light went all the way down. 3 months later, Patricia Hargrove Mills did not stop attending family events. She did not retreat into the particular kind of silence that people sometimes choose after they have been seen making the wrong decision in a room full of witnesses. She chose something harder than silence. She created a protocol, not because anyone asked her to, not because Eleanor instructed her or the attorneys suggested it. She sat down on the Sunday following the estate reading and typed a 4-page document titled Hargrove Family Estate Governance Standards, Formal Written Notification Requirements for All Family Members Before Any Estate-Related Meeting, Mandatory Independent Legal Review of All Documents Before Any Informal Agreements are Discussed, a standing rule that no employee or long-term contractor of the estate may be asked to sign any agreement affecting their residency or employment without at least 30 days written notice and access to independent counsel. She printed 3 copies. She signed all 3. She filed one with David Park's office. She gave one to Eleanor's property manager. She kept one in her bag. She carries it everywhere. She has not explained to anyone why. The weight of October is still with her. It does not announce itself every day, but it is there in the specific way of things you cannot put down, not because they are too heavy, but because you understand that putting them down would be its own kind of decision. Patricia is doing the work now. She knows, without needing it said, that doing the work now is not the same as having done it then. She knows the difference. She is learning to live inside it. The audit findings were submitted to the Virginia State Bar's Trust and Estate Accountability Division and the Fairfax County Financial Crimes Unit within 14 days of the estate reading. The investigation ran for 11 weeks. They confirmed the 3 transfers totaling $340,000 from the estate operating account to Preston's Delaware company. They identified 2 additional irregularities. Eleanor's initial audit had not reached a $47,000 equipment lease signed in the estate's name for machinery used exclusively at Preston's personal property in Loudoun County, and a $22,000 payment to a vendor whose registered business address matched Preston's secondary residence. Preston was not arrested. He was not immediately removed from any position. He had, as it turned out, never legally held a position in the estate to be removed from. He resigned from 2 Fairfax County community boards in December, citing a desire to focus on personal matters. The investigation concluded in late January. The findings were referred for civil recovery proceedings. No criminal charges were filed. Due process. The investigation ran its course. The findings are on record. The system, operating at the speed systems operate at, accounting for what had been done, not dramatically, not cinematically, but correctly. The pocket watch is still on his desk. He has not wound it. Martha Gaines repainted the cottage door in November. It is green now. She had been thinking about green for 4 years and kept putting it off, which she understands now as a thing you do when you are not entirely sure the thing you are painting belongs to you. She received a letter from Eleanor's office in early November formally establishing her occupancy as a protected tenancy under the Hargrove Family Trust. No expiration date, no conditions she had not agreed to in writing with independent counsel. She read it 3 times over 2 days. Then she framed it and hung it in the kitchen, above the window that faces the garden. The garden is in better shape than it has been in a decade. On Tuesday mornings, the property caretaker arrives, a woman named Gloria, 38, efficient, who has learned not to park in front of the garden path. They have developed the habit of coffee on the cottage steps before Gloria starts her rounds. Gloria never asks about October. Martha is grateful for that. Some things do not need to be narrated to be understood by the people who were in the room. The Hargrove estate, 3 months after trust activation, has undergone the following documented changes. 7 informal property access arrangements, agreements that had existed for years as handshakes and email threads and assumptions, have been reviewed, formalized, and converted into documented contracts, each reviewed by independent counsel. The estate operating account now requires dual authorization for any transfer exceeding $5,000. This measure was implemented in the first week. The estate's charitable provision, a clause James had embedded in the trust document that received no attention during the October reading, made its first distribution in December $85,000 to the Fairfax County Housing Assistance Fund. Per James's specific written instruction earmarked for legal representation services for families in estate disputes without counsel, the civil recovery proceeding has identified $409,000 in total irregularities across the 3-year informal management period. Recovery is ongoing. 3 additional parcels held informally for decades, land nobody had formally assessed or documented because everyone assumed they knew who they belonged to, had been properly surveyed, titled, and integrated into the trust structure. Their combined current appraised value, $890,000. None of these changes appear in a press release. None of them were announced at a dinner. They exist in filed documents, recorded instruments, and the Fairfax County Property Registry, the same place the truth has always been, waiting for someone to look. 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Recorded on a phone by a man who had arrived expecting to watch a different story unfold. It reached 2.3 million views in the first 9 days. Not because it was loud, not because it was confrontational in the way platforms usually reward. The comments, in the first 48 hours, returned to the same observation repeatedly. She never raised her voice. The clip was circulated within estate law communities, shared by 3 major legal education platforms, and referenced by 2 Virginia state legislators in a November hearing on estate proceeding transparency requirements. A legal nonprofit used a portion of it in a training module on identifying unrecorded family governance documents. The kind of document that gets presented in rooms full of people who have no reason to question it, because the person presenting it has always been in charge. In January, a bill was introduced in the Virginia General Assembly proposing mandatory independent legal representation for any non-family employee or contractor present at a formal estate proceeding where their residency or employment may be affected. It has not yet passed, but it has been read, it has been entered into the record. It exists now in a place where it can be found. Eleanor Hargrove did not take a management role at the estate. She hired Gloria. She came back to Chicago the week after the reading. She is still on the 14th floor of the building on West Monroe Street. The office is still 110 square feet. The desk is still the one she bought for $85. The view still faces the ventilation shaft. She has added a second chair. Once a quarter, she takes a pro bono case, families navigating estate disputes without legal representation. The first was a woman in rural Virginia who had been told by a relative that an unsigned, handwritten note constituted a binding will under Virginia law. It does not. The property was properly transferred. Eleanor charged nothing, drove 400 miles, and came home the same day. The cedar box from James sits on her desk. She opened it the night of October 8th after the filing was confirmed at 3:51 in the afternoon, after she drove to the eastern edge of the property, after she walked into the old chapel and found the candles Rose had laid out and stood in the west-facing light and kept the promise exactly as she had made it alone, quietly, without ceremony. Inside the box was a single item, a copy of a property deed, Henry Hargrove's deed. The 180 acres lost in 1961, recovered through a civil action James had quietly pursued and won in 2019, 2 years before he died, restoring the title to the Hargrove family trust. He had never mentioned it to anyone. He had simply done it, filed it correctly, and put a copy in a cedar box. Eleanor does not keep returning to the trust document. She does not keep returning to the conference room or the charter with no recording stamp, or the moment David Park said filing confirmed. She keeps returning to the deed, to the question she cannot fully answer: how many things did he quietly fix that nobody ever noticed? How many pieces of paper, filed correctly and on time and without announcement, are holding together things that would otherwise have fallen apart, and no one in the room thinks to look for them until the day they need them? She does not know. She is learning to sit with not knowing. Something good happened. The trust was filed and activated before the deadline. The estate is intact. Martha is in the cottage with a green door and a framed letter above the kitchen window. The $409,000 is being recovered through civil proceedings. Patricia's protocol exists in 3 signed copies in 3 separate files. A bill has been introduced. These things are real. They are measurable. They happened. It matters to say that clearly before saying anything else. But Eleanor Hargrove won because her grandfather had 17 years, the financial resources to retain separate legal counsel, and the foresight to understand that informal family tradition could be overridden by a correctly filed legal instrument. She won because she had a trust document recorded and activated before she walked into that room, because she had $22,400 in savings that let her drive 400 miles on a weekday, because she had David Park and a filing that was already complete. She won because she had the paper. What about everyone who does not? How many estate proceedings happen every year, in Virginia, in every state, in every place where property passes between generations, in which the informal document wins? Not because it is legal, not because it is right, but because the person with the correctly filed instrument could not afford, the attorney could not take the day off work, could not find someone willing to prepare a trust on their behalf 17 years before the day it would be needed? How many people sign documents they did not write, in rooms where they have no representation, because the alternative is a fight they have no resources to sustain? How many people walk away from what was theirs, not because the law said so, but because the law is only as useful as your access to it? And what does it mean that the story we tell most often, the one that travels 2.3 million views in 9 days, is the one that ends in a reveal? Not the 10,000 that end in a signature on a document nobody read carefully, in a corner of a room where nobody stood up? Eleanor Hargrove stood up. That matters. That is true, and it matters, and it should be said. And the reason she could stand up, the paper in the bag, the filing already complete, the 17 years of quiet preparation behind her, is not available to most of the people who need it. The question is not whether what happened in that conference room in Fairfax was just. It was. The question is what we call a system in which justice is most reliably available to the people who were already positioned to access it, and what we intend to do about the gap between that system and the one we say we want. Eleanor knows this. It is the question in the cedar box. The one James left her alongside the deed. He fixed what he could fix, the only way he knew how. He left her the question of what comes next. At Revenge Files Story 03, we do not soften the emotion or dilute the message. We tell powerful fictional stories inspired by the real dynamics of inheritance power and the quiet ways that systems legal, financial, and family reward those who know how to use them and leave everyone else with the conversation instead of the paper. If today's story moved you, if it made you think about something in your own family, your own community, or the structures you have always assumed were fair because nobody ever questioned them out loud, hit like. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what part of this stayed with you, and subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Because the conversation does not end here, it is just beginning. This is a fictional story inspired by real and documented issues surrounding estate law, inheritance disputes, informal governance documents, and the legal representation gap in probate proceedings. All characters, institutions, locations, and events are entirely invented. The Hargrove family and all named individuals do not exist. Any resemblance to real persons, families, or organizations is coincidental.